On April 23, 1945, in a forest clearing situated between Duisburg and Lintorf in Germany, Field Marshal Walter Model stood motionless among the trees. His service pistol rested heavily in his grip. Behind him stretched the wreckage of Army Group B, more than 300,000 soldiers who had laid down their weapons and surrendered to American forces in the preceding days. Before him lay a choice that was no choice at all. Surrender would mean breaking his oath. He would not live to see his homeland consumed by Soviet captivity. The gunshot that pierced those woods that afternoon meant far more than one man's death. It represented the endpoint of a transformation that would perplex military historians for generations. Between March and May 1945, something extraordinary unfolded across German-held territory. Nearly 3 million German soldiers walked toward American and Western Allied lines, often crossing through their own defensive formations to reach them. Men discarded weapons without firing. Soldiers emerged from fortified positions carrying white flags hastily fashioned from bed linens and tablecloths. They gave themselves up, not because their defenses had shattered, not because they lacked ammunition, not even because the war itself was already lost. They surrendered deliberately, desperately, and specifically to escape one outcome above all others: falling into Soviet hands. The sheer scale tells the story. From June 6, 1944, when forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, until April 30, 1945, the day Hitler died in his Berlin bunker, the numbers accumulate into something almost incomprehensible. Over 2.8 million German soldiers yielded to Western Allied forces on the northwestern European front. Of those staggering figures, 1.5 million came in April 1945 alone. During the first 2 weeks of that month, 39,000 men surrendered every single day. In the final 16 days, the numbers climbed even higher. 59,000 daily surrenders. These men threw down their weapons while Hitler still lived, while the Nazi government continued to function, while military law demanded they fight until death. They possessed guns, they possessed ammunition, they possessed fortified positions. What they lacked, what truly mattered, was willingness to face east, where the Red Army advanced like a relentless engine of revenge and retribution. Understanding why nearly 3 million soldiers would choose surrender over resistance requires understanding the two different fates they could suffer. Every German soldier stationed on the Western Front in 1945 had absorbed stories from the East. They heard whispered conversations. They read letters that somehow made it through military censors. They watched the hollow expressions of men transferred westward from that front, men bearing the 1,000-yard stare of those who had witnessed things that broke something inside them. These were not fabricated propaganda tales designed to stiffen resistance. These were accounts from soldiers who had seen firsthand what occurred when German troops fell into Soviet possession. They knew about Stalingrad. They knew that 91,000 survivors of the 6th Army surrendered there in February 1943. They knew that approximately 6,000 of those men ever made it home. The rest perished in the months that followed surrender, starved, diseased, worked to death, frozen in the cold that consumed them during captivity. They knew about death marches where Soviet forces herded captured Germans hundreds of miles into the Russian interior without adequate food, water, or rest. They knew about the shooting, how those who could not keep pace simply fell behind, and what happened to them. They knew about the mining camps in Siberia. They knew about the labor battalions in the Urals. They knew that the conditions in those places killed over 1 million German prisoners before 1956 ever arrived. These were not distant possibilities whispered about in rumor. These were statistical certainties, documented and discussed. The West German Maschke Commission, established after the war to investigate the fates of German prisoners of war, documented the numbers with careful precision. 1,940,250 German prisoners died in Soviet custody out of 3,600,000 captured. For a German soldier contemplating surrender in 1945, this meant better than 1 in 3 odds of dying after the shooting stopped. Even in victory, the choice meant probable death. But the fear driving Germans westward ran deeper than survival statistics. It reached into something more profound: the knowledge of what German forces themselves had done in the Soviet Union. From June 22, 1941, When Operation Barbarossa unleashed the largest military invasion in human history, German troops had waged what they themselves called a war of annihilation. They had been told, and many believed, that Slavic peoples represented something less than human. Nazi planners had created schemes for starving 30 million Soviet civilians to death, clearing space for German settlers. German forces had deliberately starved 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war, killing them at a rate of 57%. Compare that to the Americans and British. Only 3.5% of their captured soldiers died in German hands. German troops had participated directly in the Holocaust on Soviet soil, where 2 million of 6 million murdered Jews met their deaths. Villages burned, partisans and suspected partisans died, along with their families. Entire communities vanished under policies of collective punishment. The blood of 26 million Soviet soldiers and civilians clung to German hands. Every German soldier in 1945 knew this, whether he had personally pulled a trigger or held a torch. They understood that when Soviet forces came for them, they came not as military adversaries, but as agents of justified vengeance for crimes beyond measure. The contrast between American and Soviet treatment could not have been sharper. When German soldiers first encountered American forces, what they found contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught them to expect. American forces operated under explicit orders from Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower. They followed international law regarding prisoners of war. Medical care was provided. Food rations were distributed. Wounded men received treatment. Prisoners were not executed, not tortured, not forced into labor in violation of Geneva Convention rules. The reputation of American treatment spread through German defensive lines faster than any official communication could possibly travel. German soldiers who had surrendered in earlier phases sometimes remained visible from German positions, held in temporary enclosures where their countrymen could see them. They could watch these men alive, relatively healthy, receiving food and medical care. This visual evidence of survival proved infinitely more persuasive than any propaganda could ever be. When 317,000 men of the Ruhr Pocket began surrendering en masse between April 14 and 18, 1945, many had made their calculation with cold clarity. They faced encirclement, supplies were dwindling. They could break out eastward toward German lines and Soviet pursuit, or westward toward American positions. Field Marshal Model dissolved Army Group B rather than formally surrender, giving his men implicit permission to decide their own fates. The overwhelming majority walked west. The strategic calculation transcended individual survival. It represented a form of national self-preservation. By May 1945, Germans with any strategic sense understood that their nation's future survival depended on Western Allied willingness, particularly American willingness, to permit German reconstruction. Soviet-style occupation meant exploitation and suffering. American occupation meant a future. The flood of surrenders in spring 1945 had begun months earlier as military realities forced Germany toward defeat. After D-Day on June 6, 1944, when American, British, and Canadian forces established their beachhead in Normandy, the Western Front tightened like a closing fist. By September, Allied forces had liberated France. By December, they had reached Germany's western border, despite the temporary shock of the Battle of the Bulge. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviet war machine that had been gathering momentum since Stalingrad continued grinding relentlessly westward. Operation Bagration launched on June 22, 1944. The third anniversary of Barbarossa, it destroyed German Army Group Center and cost Germany between 400,000 and 450,000 casualties in 9 weeks, the largest German defeat in military history. By January 1945, Soviet forces occupied German soil in East Prussia and had advanced to within 100 miles of Berlin. The German military was trapped in a strategic vice, compressed between two massive Allied armies. Manpower exhausted, industrial capacity crippled by strategic bombing, fuel supplies nearly depleted, but one detail mattered above all others, one factor that drove German soldiers toward their desperate choice. These two Allied armies represented two completely different futures. German leadership in early 1945 recognized this reality and sought to exploit it. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who took command of Germany after Hitler's suicide on April 30th, pursued what historians would later call a strategy of successive partial capitulations in the West. His goal, now documented in captured German records held in the National Archives, was to gain time. He wanted to move as many German military formations westward as possible and surrender them intact to the British and Americans while saving them from Soviet or Yugoslav captivity. Beginning with the Italian surrender on April 29, 1945, Dönitz attempted negotiating separate surrenders to Western forces while continuing to fight the Soviets. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery accepted the surrender of German forces in the Netherlands, northwest Germany, and Denmark on May 4. On May 6, General Alfred Jodl arrived at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force in Reims, with an offer: surrender all forces fighting the Western Allies while continuing to resist Soviet forces. General Eisenhower's response demolished this strategy. He threatened to close all Western lines to German soldiers, forcing them toward Soviet surrender, unless Germany accepted unconditional surrender on all fronts simultaneously. Faced with this ultimatum, Jodl signed the unconditional surrender at 2:41 a.m. on May 7, 1945, in Reims, ending the war in Europe. The Soviets, suspicious they had been excluded from a separate peace, demanded a second signing ceremony in Berlin-Karlshorst on May 8, with their participation, which they considered the only legally valid surrender. The Battle of Halbe stands as perhaps the most dramatic evidence of German desperation to avoid Soviet capture. From April 24 to May 1, 1945, approximately 200,000 soldiers from the remnants of the German Ninth Army, along with tens of thousands of civilian refugees, found themselves encircled by Soviet forces in a shrinking pocket southeast of Berlin. Their commander, General Theodor Bucer, ordered a breakout westward toward American positions near the Elbe River. He knew that Soviet capture meant probable death. What followed was catastrophic violence. Soviet artillery, tanks, and infantry struck the pocket without mercy. German forces fought with the desperate energy of men who understood what capture would mean. Not to achieve military objectives, but simply to break through the Soviet ring and reach American lines. Approximately 30,000 German soldiers succeeded in breaking through to American safety, roughly one-third of those encircled, representing a partial success in military terms. Total deaths, encompassing both soldiers and civilians, likely ranged between 24,000 and 60,000. By comparison, in the Battle of the Ruhr Pocket, where Germans surrendered to Americans, approximately 10,000 died, including civilians, foreign laborers, and irregular forces, while 317,000 were taken prisoner. The contrast speaks volumes about which outcome German soldiers preferred. The German government's own post-war commission, headed by Erich Maschke, investigated German POW fates and documented that approximately 3 million were taken by the Soviets, of whom 140,250 died in captivity between 1941 and 1955. The Commission recorded 549,360 deaths between 1941 and April 1945, and 542,911 deaths between May 1945 and June 1950, after the war had ended. These figures, derived from German records and Soviet archives, paint a picture of systematic death. The death rate in Soviet captivity exceeded 35%. For Germans held by Americans, fewer than 1% died in custody. Men surrendering in spring 1945 did not possess these precise statistics, but they understood the fundamental truth they represented. Soviet captivity meant high probability of death. American captivity meant high probability of survival. The treatment German prisoners received from American forces initially occurred under genuinely difficult circumstances. The Rhine camps were established rapidly in April 1945 to handle the unexpected deluge of surrenders. Hundreds of thousands of German prisoners were initially held in open fields. The logistical challenge of processing 1.5 million prisoners in a single month while continuing active military operations strained resources to the breaking point. Conditions were harsh, particularly in the first weeks: inadequate shelter, food shortages, supply lines struggling to match the numbers. However, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force worked systematically to improve conditions, and by summer 1945, prisoners were transferred to permanent camps with proper facilities. The actual death toll in these camps, according to the 1974 Mashka Commission report, was approximately 4,000 to 6,000 prisoners, representing roughly a 1% death rate. The rapidity with which organized German resistance crumbled in the West, compared to the bitter fighting that continued in the East until the final day, demonstrates the depth of this preference. Consider how German casualties distributed across the fronts. German military deaths totaled approximately 5.3 million, according to historian Rüdiger Overmans' definitive statistical study. Approximately 4 million of these deaths occurred on the Eastern Front, representing 75 to 80% of all German war dead, versus approximately 1 million on Western and other fronts. The ferocity of combat, the no-quarter nature of the fighting, the determination of both sides to fight to the finish, these produced casualty rates far exceeding those in the West. In the Battle of Berlin alone, fought from April 16th to May 2nd, 1945, German forces suffered approximately 92,000 to 100,000 killed, 220,000 wounded, and 480,000 captured. The city was defended house by house, street by street. Hitler Youth fought alongside regular Wehrmacht soldiers. Men continued fighting after ammunition ran dry, after food vanished, after medical supplies disappeared. Still they fought as Soviet artillery reduced the city to rubble. On the Western Front, by contrast, German units possessed ammunition. German units held defensive positions. German units possessed genuine capability to resist. Yet they chose not to. The surrender of the Ruhr Pocket illustrated this dynamic perfectly. From April 1st, when American forces completed the encirclement, until April 18th, when final resistance ended, German defenders held every geographic advantage. The Ruhr was Germany's industrial heartland, densely populated, filled with factories and buildings and infrastructure that favored defenders. Army Group B commanded 370,000 men, 19 divisions, ample ammunition, strong defensive positions. Had they chosen to defend in a Stalingrad style, street by street and house by house, American forces would have paid a terrible price to take the pocket. Instead, mass surrenders began on April 14th after Model dissolved Army Group B. His action gave his soldiers implicit permission to choose their own fates. They chose surrender. Entire divisions marched into American lines with weapons lowered and not a shot fired in anger. The 116th Panzer Division arrived, a hardened formation that had clawed through the fighting from Normandy all the way through the grueling Ardennes campaign. They came without functioning tanks, without artillery that could fire, yet the soldiers themselves remained, alive, organized, capable of mounting serious infantry defenses if they had chosen to do so. They chose surrender instead. The arithmetic of the Ruhr Pocket told its own story. American forces suffered roughly 10,000 casualties clearing that pocket. German surrenders totaled 317,000 men. When you do the mathematics, fewer than one American casualty for every 30 Germans who laid down their arms, the conclusion becomes unmistakable. Most of these Germans never fought at all. This same pattern unfolded across the western reaches of Germany as April 1945 approached. American columns pushing eastward through the German heartland encountered what General Eisenhower described plainly as a thoroughly defeated army. One town after another raised white flags before the Americans even arrived. Resistance, when it appeared, was token at best. Most places surrendered without any resistance whatsoever. German units fell back from defensive positions only to surrender again at the next encounter, and then again at the one after that. The daily prisoner totals reveal the reality with unsparing clarity. During March 1945, American and British forces were rounding up approximately 10,000 German prisoners each single day. By the first 2 weeks of April, that number rocketed upward to 39,000 daily. Then in those final 16 days before the German collapse, the rate reached an extraordinary 59,000 prisoners captured each day. These were not exclusively soldiers killed or captured in desperate last stands. Vast numbers of these prisoners walked away from their positions voluntarily, presenting themselves for captivity. The calculation these men had made was straightforward and brutal. They could see how this story ended. They understood what came next. If they remained in their trenches and resisted the Americans, they might delay defeat by a few days, perhaps a week. But meanwhile, the Soviets were driving westward across Germany, and when those two fronts compressed, German soldiers caught between them would bleed themselves white. Fighting the Americans meant buying time for the Red Army to close the trap. If they retreated eastward, they would eventually fall into Soviet hands anyway. The only realistic path to survival, they reasoned, was to surrender to the Americans. The Americans represented their single chance to survive this war and potentially rebuild lives afterward. By May 1945, German soldiers who thought clearly about their circumstances grasped a deeper truth. Germany's survival as a nation hinged on whether the Western Allies would permit reconstruction. The future belonged to whoever won the post-war political struggle, not to whoever won the final battles. When German soldiers surrendered to American forces, they were making a choice about which Germany would exist after the guns fell silent. In the Eastern Theater, the situation looked brutally different. German units continued fighting with grim determination, even as their Western comrades were surrendering by the hundreds of thousands. Understanding why requires grasping the stark contrast between what captivity meant in each direction. When German soldiers surrendered to Americans, they could reasonably expect to survive. Individual commanders could make cold calculations, surrender this unit to the Americans, and these men might live to see Germany again. But surrender to the Soviets? The mathematics there were horrifying. Soviet camps consumed prisoners at such a rate that 1 in 3 German soldiers handed to the Red Army would never return home. Commanders who had shepherded their men through years of horrific combat could not stomach condemning them to those odds without exhausting every conceivable alternative. There was more at stake in the East than just military calculations. Every day, German forces continued fighting theoretically allowed more German civilians to flee westward, away from the Soviet advance. The catastrophe unfolding across eastern Germany in early 1945 was immense. Millions of German civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly, were streaming westward in desperate flight from the approaching Red Army. They had heard the stories. They knew what Soviet forces did to German territory. These refugees moved any way they could manage, on foot through the cold, in horse-drawn carts, crammed into trains, carrying whatever possessions wouldn't slow them down beyond survival. German military forces in the East understood their mission in those final weeks as providing a protective barrier, buying time for this massive civilian exodus to reach safety. The forces that made surrender decisions in 1945 were moved by complicated currents: military necessity, national survival, personal fear, awareness of their own guilt. Some soldiers did acknowledge the crimes they had committed, but conscience alone was not driving most of these calculations. These were soldiers trying to stay alive under conditions of nightmare complexity. They chose Americans over Soviets not from moral awakening, but from rational analysis of which choice offered the best odds of survival. That analysis was shaped by what they knew of their own brutality on the Eastern Front, and by what they could anticipate from Soviet retribution. It was shaped by what they had observed of American military discipline and prisoner treatment. It was shaped by realistic assessment of what the post-war world would look like. The war's final days in Europe played out these calculations with extraordinary drama. When the unconditional surrender documents were signed on May 7 and 8, 1945, scattered German units kept fighting in certain areas. They were racing desperately to reach American lines before the surrender took effect. The Courland Pocket in Latvia, where an entire German army group had been trapped since October 1944, held out until May 9 before surrendering to Soviet forces after the ceasefire period expired. German formations in Czechoslovakia battled Soviet troops while simultaneously attempting to break through toward American positions. In Prague, when Czech resistance fighters launched their uprising on May 5 against German occupation, German units responded with savage brutality. The streets became a battleground. German soldiers fought with vicious intensity even as the war was already officially concluded, driven by terror of what Czech partisans would do to them if they fell into resistance hands, and especially the fear that they would be turned over to the Soviets. Only when American and Soviet forces made contact and established clear division lines did the violence finally stop. For those Germans fortunate enough to surrender to American forces, the experience shaped everything that followed. The initial period of prisoner movement, rough as it was, gave way to increasingly humane conditions. As prisoners transitioned to established camps, conditions improved further. Eventually, most of these men went home. Between 1945 and 1948, the majority of German POWs held by Western allies returned to their families. They came back to catastrophe. German cities had been pulverized into rubble. The economy had collapsed entirely. The nation was carved into occupation zones controlled by different powers. Yet they came back alive. They found wives or met new ones. They had children. They rebuilt their towns and became citizens, some in the Federal Republic of Germany in the west, others in the German Democratic Republic in the east, depending on where circumstances left them. A great many became passionate advocates for Western democracy and the Atlantic Alliance. The Germans who fell into Soviet captivity experienced an entirely different trajectory. The roughly 480,000 captured during the final Soviet assault on Berlin and the more than 1 million taken during the last months on the Eastern Front entered a prisoner system designed to extract maximum labor before eventually releasing the survivors. The Soviet Union had endured staggering devastation. 26 million dead, 1,700 cities and towns obliterated, 32,000 factories destroyed. The German invasion had inflicted an economic wound that would take generations to heal. Soviet leaders, despite formal commitments to prisoner treatment conventions, made reconstruction their priority and prisoner welfare secondary. German captives became a labor force, conscripted into mines, factories, construction sites, agricultural work. Life improved after 1945 and 1946, those nightmare years when famine stalked the Soviet Union and prisoners subsisted on rations barely adequate to maintain breathing. By 1947, as the Soviet economy began stabilizing, mortality rates fell sharply. But the Soviets moved slowly toward releasing prisoners. Most German POWs came home between 1947 and 1950. The last survivors did not return until 1956, 11 years after the war had ended. The consequences of these surrender decisions extended far beyond the fates of individual men. Nearly 3 million German soldiers surrendered to Western forces. These men became the foundation upon which West German society was rebuilt. They carried home direct experience of American military power, American organizational capacity, American willingness to follow rules when dealing with defeated enemies. These experiences, combined with Marshall Plan reconstruction aid and American military protection against Soviet expansion, created the bedrock upon which West Germany built its post-war democracy. West Germany looked westward not by accident, but partly because millions of its population had once calculated that Americans were enemies you could surrender to and survive. The question of whether German soldiers who surrendered in 1945 faced justice for crimes committed under Nazi rule remains contested and unresolved. The vast majority never faced prosecution. War crimes tribunals focused on high-ranking officers, SS personnel, death camp operatives, and individuals directly implicated in documented atrocities. The ordinary Wehrmacht soldier, regardless of whether he had served in the East, regardless of whether he had witnessed atrocities or participated in them, typically returned from captivity to civilian life without legal consequences. This meant that millions of men who had participated in a war of conquest and genocide walked back into ordinary society and were absorbed into it. Soviet handling of captured Germans reflected a profoundly different approach, rooted in different priorities and different historical experience. Soviet authorities viewed German POWs primarily as a labor source to repair what German invasion had destroyed. They held prisoners longer, worked them harder, released them more slowly than the Western powers. The partition of Germany into occupation zones, which hardened into the permanent division between East and West, meant that individual soldiers' surrender decisions in 1945 often determined which Germany they would eventually inhabit. Those who surrendered westward generally ended up in West Germany. Those captured in the East generally settled in East Germany after release. Looking backward across the decades, the German surrender of 1945 ranks among history's most dramatic military collapses. What makes it remarkable is not its speed, but its selectivity. German forces did not capitulate everywhere simultaneously when defeat became inevitable. They surrendered to specific adversaries while continuing to resist others. Millions made individual calculations about survival and acted on those calculations collectively. Nearly 3 million chose to surrender to Western allies, essentially voting with their weapons and their feet against Nazi resistance and against Soviet captivity. They prioritized survival over honor, the future over ideology, pragmatism over retribution. The final reckoning for World War II in Europe contains this extraordinary statistic. Where German soldiers could surrender and survive, in the West, resistance evaporated. Where surrender meant probable death, in the East, men fought on. The asymmetry is written in the casualties. German killed and wounded far exceeded German prisoners taken on the Eastern Front. German prisoners far exceeded killed and wounded on the Western Front. This difference extracted a terrible human price. Every German soldier who died fighting the Red Army in 1945 was a man who might have lived had he been positioned facing Americans instead. Every Soviet soldier who died in 1945 fell defeating an enemy, simultaneously surrendering by the millions in the opposite direction. For American commanders receiving this enormous flood of prisoners, the experience brought conflicting emotions. American forces took pride in adherence to military law and proper prisoner conduct. The mass surrenders seemed to validate that reputation. Germans evidently believed Americans would treat them fairly. Yet American leaders also understood the underlying reality. They grasped why these Germans were surrendering. Knowledge of the Eastern Front was widespread. American officers understood what German forces had inflicted in the Soviet Union. They recognized that Germans were escaping justice more than seeking mercy. General Eisenhower navigated these delicate circumstances carefully, maintaining alliance commitments while managing the enormous human situation his armies had inherited. The post-war decades revealed the profound impact of these 1945 surrender decisions. West Germany, heavily populated by men who had surrendered to Western forces, evolved into a prosperous democracy and a reliable American partner. East Germany, where many former Soviet POWs eventually resettled after delayed release, became a communist satellite under Soviet domination. When the two Germanys reunified in 1990, the psychological inheritance of these wartime choices remained embedded in German consciousness. The Western orientation of reunified Germany, its NATO membership, its European integration, its partnership with America, all these things rest partially on foundations poured when millions of soldiers decided that Americans were enemies they could bargain with and live. The fundamental question, why German forces surrendered in such staggering numbers to Western allies rather than continue resistance against the Soviets, ultimately concerns choice under extreme duress. The contrast in what awaited prisoners was inescapable and concrete. Surrender to Americans meant roughly a 1% chance of death in captivity. Surrender to Soviets meant statistically better than a 1 in 3 chance of never returning. Given that choice, millions walked westward. The 480,000 German soldiers captured during the assault on Berlin had no such choice. Trapped in the capital with no American army available to receive their surrender, they fought to exhaustion and then faced the fate their countrymen had spent months desperately trying to evade. The soldiers who chose surrender faced no desperate final battle against American forces. Instead, they faced a future in which Americans would be partners rather than enemies, a future where survival was possible, where their nation could eventually rebuild. They surrendered their arms but preserved their lives. In the terrible calculus of war's ending, they selected what 3 million men facing death would select. They moved toward those most likely to permit survival. This choice existed in the West, but not in the East, explaining the stunning difference in German resistance patterns during 1945. It explains why the Western Front crumbled, while the Eastern Front sustained brutal fighting. It explains why American forces captured nearly 3 million prisoners while taking relatively modest casualties, while Soviet forces had to battle for every street and every building at enormous human cost. The mathematics of European victory were written not only in tactical decisions and aerial bombardment, but in the fundamental difference between two forms of captivity. One permitted survival, The other promised likely death. German soldiers, regardless of their crimes, regardless of their ideology, regardless of their devotion to Nazi authority, comprehended this distinction clearly. When the opportunity presented itself, they chose life. That choice, multiplied across millions of individual decisions rippling through the spring of 1945, shattered German organized resistance in the West, hastened the war's conclusion, and molded the post-war world in consequences that endure to the present moment.